Well, then, without further ado, as is our custom, we're not going to give highfalutin introductions of our speakers, even though they clearly deserve it. So Stephan is going to give the first 25-minute talk. Thanks, and take us away, Stephan.
Okay, thanks, Rob. So I presume you can all see my screen already anyway. Yeah, what I want to talk about is the sort of tripartite interaction between scientific knowledge, knowledge management, in particular in a crisis, and the interface between science and policy and the public. And I want to illustrate that with 3 case studies. Now, this is fairly obvious, but it has to be said anyway, that policymakers in particular, but also the public, need scientific knowledge to be accessible, applicable, and actionable. Well, that's what the policymakers say. What do they mean by that? Well, accessible means accessible. You can get to it. Applicable means it has to be problem-focused. And actionable means it has to be reliable. You have to be able to take action, policy action, on the basis of scientific knowledge. Now, one way, or the preferred way in which you can make knowledge actionable, is to base it on the scientific consensus. And there are many situations in which there is a consensus that reflects the status of scientific knowledge in a field. Now, if there is no consensus, then you have to take that into account, of course, and policy advice must be far more nuanced. So actually, from a scientific point of view, as well as from a policy point of view, it is crucial to know whether or not there is a consensus in the scientific community. Now, for some domains, there's clearly a consensus, such as the medical consensus about the relationship between tobacco and health. Smoking causes lung cancer, HIV causes AIDS, and also in climate change, where there is no scientific doubt about the fact that CO2 emissions alter climate. So that's good. And not only is it good, it is also very important because for expert testimony, for example, the consensus plays a crucial role in the US justice system. Now, there's a little bit of modification to this going on right at the moment. But as far as I know, last I checked, for the last 100 years, an expert consensus was a necessary ingredient for expert testimony to be valid in an American court. Now, the perceived consensus among scientists is also psychologically relevant when it comes to the public, because we've shown in a number of studies, this list is, it grows all the time. We have shown repeatedly that telling people about a scientific consensus quite rationally is shifting their opinion and makes them more likely to accept things, even in, situations like vaccination or climate change that are potentially controversial. So, but how do you know there is a consensus? This is what I now want to talk about for the first case study. In a static world, when things aren't unfolding on a millisecond scale, then, there's a number of solutions, and we've known this for a while. We can do bibliometrics, we can do literature analyses, we can do expert surveys, we can put together expert panels like the IPCC for climate change, et cetera, et cetera. That's all relatively well understood. And when it comes to producing documents arising from a scientific consensus, there's some literature on that tells us how to do this. And in psychology, closer to home, there are instances of this. For example, here's a 2001 paper by Kassim and colleagues that performed a survey of experts on eyewitness testimony with the specific intent to identify consensual knowledge so that it could be used in expert testimony in compliance with the Supreme Court's judgment from 1923. So This is, important stuff. People take it seriously and they work on it. But how does this work in a crisis? By crisis, I mean a situation that is unfolding very quickly, as in the case of the pandemic, or in a situation where there is a lot of contestation in the political space. How do you then deal with crisis knowledge management? And so this is where I'm now turning to my case studies. These are all case studies involving myself. I mean, why not? I'm talking about my work. So the first one is the Debunking Handbook that we published about 2 years ago. What's new here is that we pre-registered the methodology, not for a study, but the methodology of producing this document. And there's full transparency of the process by which that document was created. So that's the novelty there. I'll explain that in a moment. I'll then tell you about the COVID-19 Vaccination Communication Handbook. It's quite a mouthful. The novelty there is that it is a living document because it has click-through links to a live wiki. And that was produced in a month in response to the COVID crisis. So it illustrates how you can accumulate knowledge or manage it very rapidly. And the final thing is a manifesto for science communication as collective intelligence, which is quite recent, from just a few weeks, maybe 2 months ago, that used a variety of intelligent tools to be written, which I also want to tell you about. So those are the three case studies. Starting out with the Debunking Handbook. What is it? Well, it's a guide for the debunking of misinformation for practitioners and for the public, journalists, teachers, and it explains the pitfalls of that and makes recommendations about how to do proper debunking. But how do we know that this is worthwhile? Why, this is just something we put on the web, anybody could have done it. How do we know that this reflects valid scientific knowledge, or, as I argue, the consensus in the field? Well, let me tell you about how the book was produced. First of all, it involved 22 authors, so that already tells you something about the breadth of expertise in it. It's been fairly successful. We've had 14 translations other than English to date, including languages I didn't know existed, like Galesian. I didn't know anything about that until the handbook was translated into it. And as I argue, it is a consensus document. How can I make that claim that it's a consensus document? Well, let me tell you that about the steps that we went through to write the handbook. First we selected authors, then we pre-registered our read method, and then we followed this transparent and sometimes quantifiable method. So how do we select the authors? Well, somebody has to start it. So my core team, the coordinating lead authors, we bootstrap the process by searching Scopus for anybody who had published anything in psychology, social sciences, etc., on misinformation and debunking. We had a whole complicated search string with lots of ands and ors trying to cast a wide net. And we came up with 28 people who fulfilled the criteria of having published empirical work and more than one paper and a few things like that. We invited them. 21 accepted, 2 withdrew. So the remaining 19 became part of our team. And we pre-registered what we're going to do. We said, okay, we're going to write this handbook. How are we going to do it? Here's the pre-registration. We postulated target dates. We specified exactly what the coordinating lead authors were going to do, who was going to try, who was going to write what, how we're going to discuss drafts, et cetera, et cetera. We stuck to this pre-registration pretty much entirely. We were 2 weeks late in completing it, but other than that, we followed the methodology, added some stuff as necessary, but we never really deviated from the methodology. So what do you do? You want to tell people about debunking? Well, how do you know what to tell them? Well, the way we approach that problem is by asking all your authors to independently nominate up to 10 findings and phenomena in the relevant literature that they consider to be relevant, and up to five recommendations for practitioners. So we looked at the empirical database and the implications in terms of recommendations for practitioners. And that was described, some key references. The raw data from that step are publicly available. If you really want to trace out how we did it, you can do that. We then took these nominations and consolidated them into a single list where the origin of the recommendation, who it was on the team, was anonymized. So we didn't know who said what. We ended up with 57 phenomena, 39 recommendations, and we then asked everybody to rate them. Now, here's just a snippet of the phenomena that we identified, such as there's ideological symmetry and motivated reasoning processes between right and left, there's echo chambers, et cetera, et cetera. You can get the drift here. These are findings from the relevant literature that our team identified as being relevant. We rated them on 2 dimensions, and just to illustrate, this is what we find. So that by itself is kind of interesting before we do anything further, because it tells us if you take the leading people in the field, unambiguously identified, more or less, through Scopus, then there is a fairly consistent rank ordering of the importance of phenomena that people assign to. So the most important thing, or one of the 2 most important things, is that corrections are more effective if you add a causal alternative in addition to just saying, oh, that's wrong. Now that is something that, there is a consensus of that on that in the field, as shown in this graph. At the very lower end, people weren't convinced that news literacy interventions, something that teaches people to discover fake stuff, that may lower, coincidentally, the credibility of accurate stories. That has been shown once or twice, but we didn't think it was necessarily reliable. We then selected those items from what you've just seen, the top items that received the top ratings from the majority of authors on both confidence and importance. That was our cutoff, and that very clearly told us this is what's going to be in the handbook, and everything below that cutoff will not be. And here are just some examples to illustrate of what we discovered. This is all documented publicly. You can go and look at this. You get the data, the numbers here tell us about the agreement, et cetera, et cetera. And now we went off and we wrote the thing. And then we had a draft, which we discussed on Google Docs and Zoom and all sorts of other ways. And all of this is still publicly available. The links are in the report that is describing how we created this document. And then ultimately, voila, we ended up with a handbook. And just to check, we went through it and we made sure that every phenomenon and every recommendation, R for recommendation, P for phenomenon, that all the ones that should be included are actually there. And all the recommendations are reflected in what we tell people how they should debunk. For example, by stating a fact, then warn people about the myth, then explain the fallacy, and then reiterate the fact. This is the famous truth sandwich, where you start with a fact, end with a fact. Do the debunking in the middle. So there we are. That's just one example in which we thought plausibly, I think our claim is plausible, that we produced a consensus document of the science of debunking. And anybody who takes issue with that can go through our methodology and point out any mistakes to us if they find it. No one has done that yet, and it's been downloaded, I don't know, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of times. I don't have an accurate count at the moment, but it's certainly out there floating around the internet. So that was my first case study. Second one, much quicker because it was much more urgent and we didn't have time to pre-register anything. This came about right before the vaccines were released early in 2021. And we wanted to provide a concise guide for healthcare professionals about how they should communicate the vaccine. And of course, in the process, we also addressed the ample misinformation that's out there. Now, this one was another global collaboration, and it was an accelerated production schedule. Thank goodness for Christmas holidays, because that meant I could sit there undisturbed by anything else and write it on Christmas Day and Boxing Day. And we did it in a month. Here it is. Again, lots of authors, 27 authors altogether. To date, we have 12 translations available, including Thai and Japanese and, all sorts of languages. And the innovation here that I want to tell you about is that it's a living document, because underlying this PDF, this downloadable PDF, is a wiki. What does that mean? Well, that means that throughout the entire handbook, here are just 2 sample pages, one about myths. There are these buttons, these blue things with a little tree next to it. Now, if you click on that within the PDF, they're actually live and they take you straight to the wiki. So what's the point of having a wiki? Well, the point of having a wiki is that we can constantly update it. And we've had, I don't know, 100 or so updates, I would guess, at least, since the handbook was published in early 2021. Of course, we cannot stay ahead of the field in all aspects, but we try our best to at least record landmark changes. So it never, as far as we're concerned, there's no reason for this to become outdated, provided we keep working at it. Now, it wasn't pre-registered, so I don't want to claim it's a consensus document. We also didn't select the authors through Scopus. It was more of a snowball thing, kind of like, hey, this is important, can you do it? And then we got everybody together. But if you do go through the list of authors, I think you'll find, if you know anything about vaccinations, I think you'll find that we've got a pretty good team, to put it mildly. And we have this underlying wiki. So last case study I want to tell you about is this manifesto about science communication as collective intelligence. And that's probably the one that is closest to the heart of this sort of, core topic of your workshop. And this was done quite differently from the other case studies. And because here we had an agenda, that's why it's called a manifesto. This was not some sort of knowledge management simply to inform practitioners or the public. No, this was to make a point about what we want, what we need. And our claim is that science communication by individuals is suboptimal for a number of reasons. Of course, idiosyncrasy, but also that an individual scientist cannot overcome all the misinformation that's out there on vaccines, for example. So what we need some collective intelligence to communicate a scientific consensus in a nuanced manner that does the evidence justice and that retains the diversity of views. Well, and to make a point about this, to say, okay, here's a case in point, we produced this manifesto by practicing what we're preaching for, by practicing what we're trying to achieve. This just came out about 2 months ago, 24 authors. By that, I mean the core people who actually did the writing, but there's a larger community of, I think, up to 100 people who are now taking it a step further through use of these smart tools that I'll tell you about in a minute, which is also publicly available. And this is how we did it. We started out with a 2-day workshop on this topic in November 2021. That was intended nearly 100 people, I think, on the 2 days. And we had some, high-profile guest speakers from Springer Nature and WHO and Science, the journal sent their journalist. We had a pretty good collection of people there. Then we turned all the notes from that workshop into, at the time, initially 188 sort of propositions, claims, statements that the authors, the people who volunteered to write this, then voted on for inclusion. And anything that got, again, a majority of votes for inclusion, that was included in what 6 groups of authors then wrote. Okay, so we took a workshop and turned it into text with a filter in between by all the authors voting on what they thought was worthy of inclusion. And we then combined these independent writing efforts and yet again turned the paper into a list of brief statements. And we then used a tool called Polis. I don't know how many of you have heard of it. If you haven't heard of it, let me just briefly introduce it. Their soundbite is you input a crowd and you get out meaning. And you know what? It's actually pretty good. Let me explain to you how it works. What you do is you present people with items that they can agree or disagree with, or refuse to answer if they have no clue. Here are 2 of 146 items that emerged through this process I just explained. So, for example, it is only when public beliefs are built on reliable knowledge that we can successfully address blah, blah. And then something about meta-analyses and statistical packages and 144 others in between. Now, these items were presented initially to all the authors, and we voted on them, not knowing what anybody else was doing. So agree, disagree, pass. And then Polis takes all that and does some pretty interesting stuff. So what I'm showing you here, for example, is a point cloud of responses to these 146 statements, with the ones that attracted a consensus shown on the left and the ones being divisive shown on the right. I've highlighted the most consensual statement, which reads, organized efforts to misinform, blah, blah, prevent citizens from implementing scientifically grounded solutions to problems. Everybody agreed with that. In, as it turns out, 3 different groups of participants. We have A, B, and C referring to different groups of participants clustered on the basis of their responses, which I'll turn to in a moment. It's one of the things you get out of Polis. At the other end, we have the most divisive statement, and you can see that, it found endorsement only in group A, but not B and C. And the statement is that in an infodemic management infrastructure, both individual experts and the collective can each play their own role, et cetera, et cetera. Well, apparently that was divisive. 10 people hated it, 10 people liked it. So, no, that's very valuable knowledge, because then, this is something you got to discuss and you got to fight over, which you might not have known without running Polis. And just to illustrate further, this identifies the 3 groups of authors, A, B, and C, and how they were clustered in terms of their endorsement of the various statements. The numbered little things there you can see are all the 146 statements, and the distance from the center, I think, is endorsement, the extent to which they were endorsed. And there are these distinct clusters of people. And what we then did was to take only statements that received at least 60% support from all of us. And we took those to turn it into the manifesto. And we used a piece of AI to just slap in these statements, and for that AI to create the first draft from the statements. That kind of worked, but it read like an undergraduate essay. So we had to rewrite it because it wasn't good enough. Although if if you need help, if you want to, Quillbot is actually used in other ways. I've used it. If you want to write an abstract for a paper, just slap the paper in there and say, summarize it, and you get an abstract. That's pretty good. It's the AI is pretty good. So that was my first case study. My last case study. And I think, okay, I've taken just under 25 minutes. The conclusions are kind of obvious, in a crisis, knowledge management must be rapid and accurate, and we can do this in a number of ways. And I've given you 3 case studies of various different ways in which we have tried to achieve that. And the tools are out there, and we can use it to manage knowledge. And there's a bunch of funders who I have to say thank you to. And I'll thank you for your attention and leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was great. A whirlwind overview of 3 awesome projects. I see that Ben Motz has a question.
I agree. My consensus is that was an awesome presentation as well. I was just curious. It seems like it's implicit in what you were saying, but I wanted to ask it directly. That you're saying that well-conducted systematic review by an individual researcher would be more prone to bias than the opinions of a couple dozen published experts. And I was wondering if that's a takeaway that you would endorse, and if so, why that is.
Gosh, I wouldn't go that far. No, I hadn't thought of it. Yeah, you're kind of flipping it around. If I'm saying this is great, then anything not like that has to be bad. I haven't actually taken that step. I think if you do a systematic review and you follow the PRISMA, whatever it is, guidelines, and you pre-register that, then I think that's probably a very good thing to do. And gosh, now, if 30 people did it, would it be less biased than if 2 people did it? I suspect the answer is yes, but I have no idea about the slope and the point of diminishing returns on that function. So, it's a very good question, but I don't really have an answer. And I never thought of flipping it around and saying other things are bad.
Sorry, can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
I halfway expected you to say that there's some advantage if you have more voices, and that itself is a debunking feature, that if you just had more people all agreeing, that might be better than just having one author on its own.
Yes, well, I would argue, we know that, the wisdom of the crowds is well known and well researched, and of course you get a better signal if more people work on it independently, or at least if their expertise isn't entirely correlated. I think that, to me, is yes, I think that's fairly obvious, but it doesn't follow from that we have to stop writing papers on our own. I still do it. And it also, I think, depends on the purpose of what you're writing. If the purpose is to inform policy based on a scientific consensus, then yes, having more people and having one of these systematic processes in place, I think is very important. Because, policymakers really have to know what's going on. And so I would definitely recommend that. But on the other hand, if you are writing a paper to advance your own theory of visual perception or whatever, well, the objective there is not to pretend there's a scientific consensus, but to throw in something into the marketplace of ideas that other people may then evaluate. And I see no reason why you shouldn't do that on your own. I think they're different purposes. Christina, I think.
I'm just kind of a process nerd for this kind of validation. When you were using Polis, did the participants have a chance to make a totally new statement, or were they constrained to?
Well, a good question. Polis allows that. Which makes it very interesting, because you can also generate new knowledge through Polis if people do it iteratively and keep coming back, or if a group of people in a room is doing it at the same time, because all the new statements pop up for everybody else to agree with or disagree with. So I've used it in that context, and it's actually fantastic. It's great fun to do that. Because people all of a sudden throw in new stuff and you figure, oh yeah, cool. So you agree with that, and all sorts of stuff happens. However, we didn't do that in our case. We turned off that feature, but it was certainly part of that. And if it were in different situations, I would turn it on and get people to generate new things.
Great, thank you.
Okay, great. Maybe we will have similar questions, particularly leaping off of Stephen's third project, which is, as he was saying, most relevant to augmented intelligence. But I think we should first segue to Mirta's talk so that we can have more time for the group discussion afterward.
Can you hear me and can you see my slides? You can? Okay, great, thanks. Hello, my talk is a little bit different, but it also, I need to put a presentation, one moment. I mean, it also tackles this issue of why we as a collectives cannot tackle these pressing problems of which epidemics, misinformation, science denial, but also spread of conspiracy theories, dealing with climate change, mass shootings. Why can't we as collectives reach seemingly obvious solutions? And why are some collectives maybe better than others in some of these problems? And how should we maybe find a more rigorous way to think about this? And so this work is a product of a child of many, many parents that all met at the Santa Fe Institute before the pandemics. This is a very interdisciplinary group, and some of these people are here in this room. But we were all working one way or the other on how collectives perceive and adapt to the world. Only we were working on it from different labels. Some of us believed they are working on social learning, others on collective intelligence, on wisdom of crowds, on belief dynamics, group decision-making, cultural evolution. And we realized in the process of our discussions that if we really want to make progress in this area and develop science of collectives that can really answer these questions that I mentioned, we need to synthesize this work across disciplines and develop a theoretical framework that enables quantitative models of collective dynamics. So in a way, we started to humbly work on the new social science in a way that will finally be able to provide answers to these questions. And I should say, I'm not going to provide any answer to these questions today. It's just that I will be describing this meta framework that we concocted and that is also still in development that might help us to see these problems a little bit differently and ask new questions, develop new models that integrate this knowledge from different disciplines. So that then eventually might help us to answer these questions. So as you know, we are all members of different collectives, from families to offices and local and national and international groups, and the scale and complexity of these collectives is constantly increasing, and it speeds up the development of all these problems I mentioned. And I will argue that to understand this phenomena, we must better understand how are we collectively adapting to our changing world and navigating this complex landscape, this thing underneath, of multiple problems that we are facing at any given moment. And we need to understand different trajectories that our collectives can take while trying to navigate, roll through this landscape. And so being at Santa Fe Institute, we of course conceptualized the problem of collectives as complex adaptive socio-cognitive systems in line with Holland from some time ago, including, so in this complex social cognitive system include social integration strategies, social environments, and problem structures. And then, which I will describe each briefly in a moment, but then the collective adaptation is then dynamic interaction of these elements in this complex problem space, and we are interested in how collectives navigate this space. So this approach goes beyond the current focus on collective intelligence. In collective intelligence, we have so far been mostly focused on finding the intelligent group or evaluating how intelligent or stupid our collective is, or other collectives are in particular, for finding ways to optimize collective performance on a given task, and typically by only changing one component of the system. And I myself have done such research. For example, I looked at how, with colleagues, how teams with different fixed cognitive strategies and fixed network structures perform on some well-defined tasks, be it something like way of the ox or choosing between discrete choices. And this approach is valuable when a group focuses on a single task, where goals are agreed upon by everyone, when we do not expect dynamic changes in network strategies and tasks. However, in many situations of any real world complexity, it can be difficult to define what is an optimal solution. And collectives often grapple with many problems simultaneously. They disagree on desirable solutions. Problems are changing. And so the question is then not, are we intelligent or stupid, but rather how and why did we get here? And where are we going? And so we want to see basically how these problems, network structures, and integration strategies adapt to each other over time. Here are some just examples of unexpected collective trajectories to give you a flavor why a collective adaptation approach could be useful. So for example, teams that are successful early on can over time become less successful, because as a team that's successful early on can become more interconnected, people might start liking each other more, the diversity of belief of their solutions and opinions might decrease, which in turn impairs their future performance on complex tasks. Another example is a nice study by Axey in 2018, where a collective that manages to nurture cooperation, and where the cooperation increases, actually opens itself for a collapse of cooperation later on, because early success in cooperating promotes weaker ties that over time actually reduce cooperation. And then something that I'm working on also is that outgroup threat. A group that experiences a threat from an outgroup will often adopt a more homogeneous mindset that's prejudiced towards intruders, and that can, as bigoted as it sounds, it can allow for a quick collective action in times of an attack from another group. But if such a mindset is not justified in the long run, then it can, or if it persists after the threat has passed, it can allow for easier spread of harmful beliefs, because there are fewer, the divergent beliefs are not encouraged. And so that can endanger the group in the long run. Okay, so there are some examples, and an important challenge in studying all this is that different aspects of this complex socio-cognitive adaptive system has been studied in different disciplines. So social integration strategies in cognitive science, and social psychology, cultural evolution, and so on, and some others, maybe in social environments, of course, in sociology, computational social science, economics, problem structure, then again, organizational science, political science, economic, problem structure being kind of more broadly something beyond individual and the social network. So all kinds of problem structures have been studied in different other disciplines, and these disciplines do not communicate with each other enough. There are also another related problem is that all of this collective behavior, performance, intelligence have been studied under many different names. So we have collective intelligence, social learning, collective problem solving, wisdom of crowds, group decision making, belief dynamics, culture evolution, game theory, some parts of game theory, group minds, and so on. And so all of them contribute something a little bit different, but all of them also share many important parts, which I will go on next. And this lack of communication then brings up some parallel efforts. And one excellent example, I think, is this finding that accuracy of majority rule depends on group size. That's something that Condorcet noticed in 1785. And here you see that on the x-axis you have average member accuracy. On the y-axis you have accuracy of group majority. And as long as the average member's accuracy is higher than 0.5, then the larger the group, the more accurate will be the group majority, and more accurate than any member. And then this also has a flip side. When the task is difficult and average member is less than 50% accurate, then, for example, when people were predicting 2016 election, Trump, Hillary, most experts were actually wrong. And so if you have a group of these experts and they are taking a decision by majority, they'll be even stupider, if you wish, than any individual person. And this can be described by a simple cumulative probabilistic process. And Laplace has described this in 1800s, and then it was completely forgotten and not mentioned later in social sciences. It has been rediscovered in political science by Groffman in '84, then independently in cultural evolution in the '80s, and in statistical physics, in psychology, in sociology, which is where it's called complex contagion, but it's just a frequency-based rule, and in biology. And then furthermore, it has been discovered that smaller groups can sometimes outperform larger groups facing several tasks. And this has been again found in political science in the '80s, in biology, and then I discovered this with my colleagues in 2018. So this is all nice, you know, each one of us contributed something new, but without at least occasional integration, essentially a lot of work is being done over and over again. And so here we are the 20 of us, embarked on first on a literature review of efforts to study collective adaptation in different disciplines, and then on a framework for collective adaptation that could be used to study it more rigorously. So I will review in turn each one of the, just very briefly, we wrote a paper which is available online with tons of too many references, and I will just I mentioned briefly that we reviewed the literature on strategies for integration of social information and realized that many of these strategies, although studied under different names, belong to several basic classes that share common principles and information requirements and properties. And to recognize those is illuminating. So one big class are frequency-dependent strategy, different majority, plurality, unanimity, and so on, complex contagion rules that have been studied in many different disciplines. And so in this example, in this network, the majority decision would be number one. Then there are averaging strategies whereby information of others' beliefs and behavior is averaged, either with or without weights. And this again has been studied in many disciplines. The advice-taking literature also falls here. Different kind of voter rule and easing models are also in the long run averaging strategies. Contagion rules and epidemiology also in a way averaging strategies. And here in this network average answer would be 2. So they bring different, they produce different answers. And then we have model-based strategies. Now this is a favorite of cultural evolution and social psychology literatures, also in other literatures where it has been found that often that humans and other animals often tend to follow particular individuals based on certain characteristics. So either those that are most confident, or they seem to be, that they are experts, or they're most similar to one. Here, if number 3 is the biggest, signifying the leader, that the answer will be number 3. Okay, so those are the strategies. And there is, of course, much more that can be said. Then we also looked at various research on social environments, and on the most basic level, social environments can be conceptualized as consisting of social networks. The social networks interact with these social integration strategies because they provide information, samples that people and groups can use to make decisions, and they can promote or block certain kind of information. And there are, of course, numerous things that can be said about social networks. Books have been written and we cannot review this, but we at least listed some of the phenomena that we think are important for collective adaptation. For example, the difference between perceived and objective networks. So far, much of the literature on social networks has been done by measuring sociometrically or on social media so-called objective networks, actually measuring who visibly communicates with another person. But we know from psychology, of course, that what is a perceived relevant network will depend a lot on a particular task, on past experiences, in-group, out-group divisions, and so on. And so this relationship has not been studied enough. Then there is the issue of homophily that by itself can explain many things that look like cognitive biases, such as false consensus and false uniqueness. There are things like friendship paradox, which is very interesting, because one's friends on average in most networks have more friends than oneself. And so basically looking at one's friends is a good, can provide one a good signal of what is happening in the broader society. And these friends are also in turn the main spreaders of new information. So that's interesting. And then of course, more broadly, there are numerous other aspects of social environments that one can spend books and books on reviewing, but it's something to keep in mind when thinking of collective adaptation. These are different languages and scripts, communication channels, institutions, and so on. And then problems. I mean, a complete description of problem structure, of course, would involve, would require a complete description of the world around us, which is impossible. But we wanted to emphasize in this review that it is important to understand that many studies in collective intelligence and related areas usually focus on one type of problem or a type of related types of problems. There are nice exceptions, but oftentimes generalized conclusions are based on a one type of task, whereas we notice that actually tasks that, for example, involve categorical or continuous judgment, simple and complex task landscape, one-shot and repeated problems will have different statistical properties and the conclusions about nature of collective intelligence adaptation will be different. And so we kind of pointed out that this is important, and as well as understanding that the global environments will constrain, more global environments such as economic, political, cultural factors will constrain the nature of problems that the collective is facing, the nature of decision rules that the collective can take, is the democracy or autocracy, the nature of networks that a person is embedded in, whether it is possible to communicate with everyone or whether there is a segregation in a society and so on. All right, fine. But so what? Why is this all important? Why is it important to look at the interaction of building blocks? Let me quickly show you just a simple static example from one of our previous studies, which was motivated by contradictory findings about network structure and wisdom of crowds. There are prominent studies that are showing that poorly connected and slow networks are better. So in this picture, if we have a average group performance over time, those that are in ring lattice support, poorly connected network, actually achieved higher performance than those in a well-connected network. And then you have other prominent paper and maybe some others showing that well-connected networks are better. And the question is why? And our intuition was there has something to do with social learning strategies or social integration strategies. And so we compare the performance of collectives using best member rule, which is a fast rule because on every step you can find someone who have a better solution than you in this task. Whereas majority, the slow rule, it is sometimes not possible to make a decision because there is no solution that's in the majority. And in that case, one explores on one's own. Rob Goldstone has a paper on it in 2014. Again, this is a rediscovery, which showed that in a much more elegant way. But basically, the idea is that if the social integration rule is very fast, then it's more beneficial to be embedded in a more scarce network. If the social integration rule is slow, then it's better to have a highly connected network. You know, imagine in COVID times, suddenly your dense network of collaborators maybe met only once a week over Zoom, then it would be beneficial to actually use a faster decision rule than to postpone decision-making until there is a majority. And in contrast, if we are all using Slack and we are all super connected, it's better to not jump on the first seemingly better solution, but use a slower rule. Anyway, so when we look at these seemingly contradictory studies, we see that those who show that slow network is better actually use best member strategy. And those who show that fast network is better actually use the frequency-based strategy. So there is that. And so I think that illustrates one reason why it's important to study all of these, the whole system of cognition and networks. Okay, so let's talk about collective adaptation. And how does this all fit together in a dynamic aspect? And so now we are coming to the realm of more caricature models and more like a framework for future research rather than any solutions yet. I would just invite you all to think with us how this could be best modeled and solved. So we can visualize this process of collective adaptation in this simplified space of cognitive strategies, these integration strategies, on the horizontal axis, the network structures on the vertical, and then different problems. And the idea is that they all evolve together in response to each other and to the global environment over time. And so in real applications, we would rely on empirical data, but here we are just looking at this cartoon example where a collective is facing 3 problems. That's good, only 3. And each of them is best solved by a different combination of integration strategies and network structures. So at time 1, problem 1 is the most important. It's the largest, and it's at the top of this. Solving it would produce the largest payoffs, as signaled by the biggest hump of this underlying landscape. And so the collectives then adjust to adopt the network structure and the integration strategy. So is it a democracy or autocracy or whatever it is, to solve this particular problem. Now, imagine that at time 2, the payoffs of solving these problems have changed either because of some external environmental changes or some endogenous dynamics, and now problem 2 is most important. For example, we have solved the pandemics, which was maybe problem 1, but now the problem becomes increased polarization. And now the collective is trying to adjust the network structure and integration strategy to solve this problem too. Maybe we introduce more majority rules, maybe more horizontal connections. But then at time 3, the problem structure changes again. And now the problem 3 becomes most important. Let's say that a large war is facing the nation, and now we need to adapt towards quite a distant set of networks and strategies, which are more hierarchical maybe. We all need to follow the leader and so on. So these kind of transitions from some problems to other problems can be quite long. So as we see from problem 2 to problem 3, a collective might need to somehow overcome significant dips in this landscape and basically accept initially unfavorable solutions to reach more favorable solutions in the problem space. And so over time, the collective basically floats in this space depending on the current problems. And now we can already see some implications of this point of view, although it's vastly simplified. One is this path dependence. As I mentioned, collectives facing the same set of problems can take different trajectories in this space. And so they exhibit, in other words, path dependence. And this might help us to understand why some collectives may be faster or slower to adapt to emerging problems. It depends on what kind of problems they were solving in the past and what kind of existing network structures, integration strategies they must deal with. So if the collective had a hierarchical network structure and they were deciding by following a leader, it might be quite difficult to go towards towards democracy, where the integration strategy is kind of majority rule and network structure is more horizontal, or the other way around. So that's one implication. The other is that this perspective does not assume a single latent dimension of collective intelligence that would explain some collective superior performance. It's just that collective intelligence can emerge from very different combinations of underlying strategies and networks. There is no intelligent collective. There is an adapted collective to a particular circumstance, but there is no general trait of intelligence according to this perspective. The third is that it's quite obvious that current collective behavior might not be optimized to any one of the problems, and it actually reflects individual and group attempts to perform well enough on at least some of the problems. The fourth is that there could be a myopia, that strategies and networks that are best suited for a particular problem might not at all be immediately obvious to a particular collective. I'm from Croatia, and we had socialism, which was not that bad in all aspects, but we definitely had a different network structure and rule integration strategies than are required by democracy. And Croatia and other countries that attempt to go towards democracy it's often not obvious to collectives which way to take, what needs to be done. There are often a lot of this, high, deep valleys and high hills that need to be overcome on the way to it. And so there's always a chance that the collective will revert to previous solutions simply because they don't see where they need to go. So how? And then the fifth is that exploration of these collective alternatives is beneficial. And that when environment changes, the collective can adapt to it to right decision faster. And so maybe this is more for fun, but it could be one of the reasons why we love stories and social games and movies and series about alternate realities, because it kind of helps us to, at least I'm telling to myself when I lose time on that, that it helps us to explore alternate realities and maybe reach a solution faster when the environment changes. Okay, so what are some emerging research questions that this framework can help us to answer? So there are many, but I already mentioned, and it's one question that then presents itself is to why is it sometimes hard for collectors to reach seemingly obvious solution? And so the answer here would be that collectors try to solve many different problems at the same time, that integration strategies and network structures suitable for one problem can interfere with solving other problems. For example, some strategies used in the US to integrate different preferences were maybe suitable 200 years ago, but they don't seem to be so suitable for the problems the society is facing today. But those are some remnants from the path that the society has taken before. And so also a related thing is that collectors can be stuck in an unfavorable part of problem landscape where moving in any direction brings temporary worse performance. And so dealing with climate change or changing the social integration strategy from electoral college to something else might reduce profit, employment levels, fitness of key members of the collective, which might make them reluctant to initiate changes that would lead to collectively better outcomes. Another is related is why do some collectors develop successful solutions and others fail? Again, as it was obvious during the COVID-19 pandemic, some countries managed to achieve a high level of vaccination, others not. It could be that just the way societies were grappling with problems before made them more or less likely to accept solutions that were necessary to solve the pandemics. For example, there is a nice series of studies by Katrin Schmelz in PNS showing that East Germans were more likely to accept government-enforced vaccination than West Germans that were more traditionally allowed to be more individual and the networks are more decentralized. Another is like, why do some successful collectives experience reduced performance over time? This is something I mentioned at the beginning. Could be that, so the first two bullets where the problem changes, but the network strategies, network structures and integration strategies stay the same, and that impairs the performance. This third bullet is more about the problem stays the same, but because of the early success or early performance, the strategies and the network structure has changed. And so collectives can become less successful over time. And then, of course, something that we all want to know is how do collectives change? So what does this mean, actually? What is this collective adaptation? How do collectives change their integration strategies and network structures to adapt to different problems? What are these mechanisms? What are the meta-level strategies that collectives use? And this is really an open question, and certainly goes on many levels, from individual to institutional. But how do collectives actually detect the change and decide to change is really, I think, an interesting question that comes from this framework. And finally, something that we all want to know is how can we anticipate new problems that might emerge because of collective adaptation to past problems? Can we somehow nudge ourselves out of a hole and direct ourselves towards a better part of the problem space? I will just briefly go, because I'm getting out of time, over. We also discussed, so, this was all blah, blah, wonderful, a big review, implications, but we want to do something rigorous. We want to be able to measure, collect empirical data and then plug them in quantitative models to be able to produce actual quantitative predictions of trends that we are expecting over time. And this is a tall order, but we really believe that without the ability to do that, we cannot achieve progress as social scientists in really explaining the world around us. We need to confront our own predictions and test them with empirical data to be able to really improve the science. And so some candidates for such quantitative models are Bayesian social learning models, cultural evolution models, statistical physics models, very elegant, can be used. And all of that, of course, once you start using empirical data in the real world, they're often not analytically solvable anymore. So computational models based on any of these or other analogies can be used. I will stop here. So in sum, I was talking about collectives and collective adaptation and disciplinary silos and how collective adaptation emerges and quantitative models. And all of that leads us only to more new questions. But so although I didn't answer any of the crucial questions of our role today, I hope it can just nudge you a little bit to see our problems a little bit differently and our societal response to them a bit more in terms of adaptation rather than intelligence or stupidity, and develop new theories and models that can help explain these pressing problems. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Ben, would you like to ask your question in person? And then Stephen.
Yeah, sure. So my question is really, you have looked at collectives that seem to be stable. What happens if new members are added or some existing members disappear? You know, how long does it take before your collective is stable again?
I think that's a great question that in our framework, if you want to push it somewhere, that would be the problem of the social structure. And to the extent that new members will change the existing social structure, that would then affect the collective ability to share information or cope with the problem. And that would, and then it's an open question, depends on the problem, on the social interaction with other elements, how it would affect the stability of the system.
Because in my area, we deal a lot with user teams when we're designing things. So after a while, if I see that as a small collective, right after a while you get groupthink, but then we try to force refresh, right? But then it takes a long time before that collective, reestablishes itself. So
I see. That's interesting. So it's almost like collective is solving several problems. One is solving the task for which you refreshed it, but there is also the problem of cohesion, trust, other problems that are now disturbed.
Exactly.
Where this new network structure actually hurts them.
Right.
So I know how to, I can only say how I would pose the problem, the question. I don't know how to solve it, but I guess that's interesting to think of it as from the point of view of collective, this group trying to solve several problems at the same time, and then acknowledging that new network structure will hurt on some problems, benefit on others. And that actually some of these problems that it will hurt on will also hurt the performance on the main problems you're trying to solve, and that's the performance. And one could actually make an interesting computational model, at least from that, and see
Thank you.
what happens.
Is it my turn, Rob? Yeah. Thanks. So fascinating talk. Thank you very much. You raised a number of huge critical issues, which I tend to think about in very different terms. So what I often think about is the role of narrative in determining social structure and determining what people, who people elect and what their preferences are. And it strikes me that, that is the foundation of ideology, which at least today, and not only today, is driving so much of what people do. So, when I look, you only devoted one slide to computational models, but what I could see from them is that all of them seem to depend on kind of pairwise interactions among people. And it strikes me that, that's not how narrative and ideology work. So, there are a lot of informational constraints, right? What makes a good story? What makes something convincing? So I'm just wondering how you think about those kinds of factors.
No, I love narratives. I think they're very important. I completely agree. Stories, the collective. Maybe you can also link them to social norms, collective traditions, culture.
Absolutely.
And all of that will somehow, it's a certainly important fact. I mean, that's the crucial thing that will somehow determine visible pathways to the collective, I would say. What is possible in a way? Who are we? How do we make decisions? Who do we talk to? Who do we not talk to? What are the problems that are important to us? All of that is, I guess on my slides, there will be something akin to culture or norms, but it's definitely the narrative is one of the main vehicles in which this is transferred, where narratives is both verbal, but also movies, films, monuments, everything around us is a part of this narrative, which then kind of influences what we are going to take. And so in my view, it's part of the setting the problem of a particular collective, so let's say that I want to do a computational model of some society. What would I do? I would try to have a consideration set of different social integration strategies that this collective is assuming, of different network structures that this collective could take. And in some societies, some may be very segregated societies, some network structures will never be possible. In some societies, some decision-making strategies will never be possible. So studying the narratives of a particular society and the norms and historical path would help me to, as a researcher, to define this consideration set, which then can start guiding, limiting a little bit the enormous space, otherwise, of possible things that we could then model.
I see. So the idea is that the role of narrative and ideology would be prior to the application of your computational modeling.
I would think so. It would be something to set it up. Because this model needs to be constrained. This is everything that I said is huge. So somehow we need to find a way to constrain, and understanding the narrative and norm culture of particular society is one way of constraining it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know, were there any other questions for me, or do we want to open?
Jan, I think, has one.
Yes, thank you. So, Mirta, I appreciate your talk. Very interesting. Some of the modeling frameworks that you suggested tend to assume that the nodes of the networks are simple and complexity arises from interacting among these nodes. But in the real world networks that we study, the nodes might not be simple. For example, humans are complex creatures. Why do we need to assume simple nodes when we build our models?
You're completely right. It's a simplification to assume that, of course, so when we build models, we will need to do some simplification. So I'm not defending it, you're completely right. In some cases, we might be able to justify the simplification of representing some nodes as less complex than they are, depending on the phenomena that we are trying to explain. And of course, there are models where there is a network of beliefs in people's heads, and then there is a network of people that interact with each other, like talking nets or others. But they are complicated. It's just even analyzing one network of belief network, semantic network in one's head is, of course, very difficult. Now, when we have people interacting in a large collective, it could be possible, but it might be at some point somehow there is a trade-off between making reproducing the world in the model and making the map of the world, right? All clips. So I would say, well, I completely agree. It will be the problem of the particular model or particular reason why we are modeling what we want to explain, where we can cut off and simplify.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
In the spirit of beginning to broaden the questions, I'd like to, I think Stephen will have an opinion on at least well. And this is a question of what the image is. So, like, I feel like Stephen's situation, the people who write about debunking information, and there are probably people that if you do a snowball recruitment from there, you'll end up with reasonable people. But what if you started with wrong and the people that they are going to be recruiting are even wronger headed than they are, etc.
Yeah, Rob, I only heard part of that. You were breaking up. I think you asked me what happens if you choose people in a snowball system and they become wronger as you go along. Was that the tenor of the question? And I think the answer to that was shown in Mirta's graph about Condorcet's jury theorem. Now, if you start out above whatever the midpoint is, usually 50% correct, right? Then as you increase group size, you're going to approach 100% collectively. And if you start out below and you create a bigger group, then you end up in at the extreme other end. And I can think of a few countries around the world that have governments that started out below and converge on a fairly catastrophic situation. I say this from Berlin, which is a safe distance from the UK. So yeah, I think it would go catastrophically wrong. And the assumption is, I suppose, in all of this, that if you start out with a group of experts, that they're hopefully above that point, but they don't have to be. Does that answer your question? I hope I spoke to it.
I don't know if how Rob decided to type, but may I ask you a question, Stephen? I was just at another panel, and people were asking how come that science communication is so inefficient, and why do people inject, cleaning products and I don't know, drink Coke and do all kinds of stupid stuff, and we somehow cannot seem to convince them. What is the problem?
Well, I think, okay, good question. And I mean, the answer is multifaceted. There's a number of things. First of all, the person who tells you to inject bleach has a much louder, volume in society than the poor scientists who are writing journal articles or at best give media interviews. I mean, that's the first problem, that the distribution of communicative power in society is extremely lopsided. And if you get somebody with a lot of power to say things that are extremely bad or stupid, then, well, what do you expect? That's one outcome. That's one problem. The other problem, of course, is that science communication, whether you like it or not, is highly politicized at the moment in, well, most countries, not everywhere perhaps, but certainly in the United States. And, I mean, in the United States, even vaccines and masks have become politicized, and if you think about it, I mean, it's sort of pretty strange that would happen. Maybe vaccines, they've always had a political history, but masks, I mean, come on, it's not, it's like, how can you get excited or exercised over that? And that is part of the problem. At the moment, it becomes politicized. People no longer listen to the scientists or the content of a message, but they go with their tribal identity, and they reject anything that is opposing that tribal identity. I think that is a serious problem we're having. And to overcome that polarization is, difficult. There are some things that we know, for example, consensus messaging. I mentioned that briefly earlier on. Consensus messaging does tend to reach people who normally would not listen to scientists. There's some evidence for that. But of course, the effects are small, right? So it's not going to solve the problem. I think most of the problems you're talking about are political. They have little to do with scientific communication.
So should we as scientists kind of invest more in understand better how to communicate our message, not in a typical scientific way where we try to devoid our message from values, from other meaning, but kind of acknowledge that people have different beliefs in their heads, and then they're embedded in these networks of beliefs, and that maybe we should try to wrap our messages in values that people have.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, to some extent, yes. We should do the best we can to reach different audiences. And there's a lot of research showing that science communication is more successful if the messenger and the audience have a similar culture and they can talk to each other in a similar language. That certainly helps. One of the most effective climate communicators in the United States is Catherine Hayhoe, who's a Christian. She's married to a fundamentalist pastor, in fact. And so she can talk to people in West Texas, which is where she lives. She can talk to them and it's okay. It doesn't blow up because they share a culture. But that doesn't mean it's going to be enough. I think, so yes, I'm supporting everything you say. Fine-tune our methodologies and rhetorical techniques and the framing, and we gotta do it right. But that by itself is not gonna achieve anything if there are powerful political forces arrayed against it. And we have to be realistic about that, I think.
One last question. I know that there are questions in the chat. I'll stop talking, but I'm just so sometimes annoyed that sometimes I have a backlash from when I talk about the need to communicate to the audience in a way that they understand and can accept and integrate in their value system. Some scientists would say, or at least maybe until a couple of years ago, oh, well, we're never going to reach this 50% of population. This half is lost to us. We're just not even going to try. And that's just horrible. And
yeah, well, I mean, it's, yes.
There is not enough interest, I think, in scientific community still in some parts to really step up.
I think there's a mix of things. I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. There are some scientists who are very reluctant to step up and to communicate and to, become part of the media landscape and all that. And for good reason, because, some people just hate it. And it's also dangerous because you're exposing yourself to attacks. So I have some sympathy for people who say, well, that's not for me. It's also true that there are some people who will never be able to reach. There's no question. I mean, there are some, we know how many they are. There's about 10 to 20%, I would have thought, of the American public who will never be reached by climate change communication or by vaccination communication, simply because they're committed to opposing that. It's part of their identity is climate denial or being an anti-vaxxer. It is part of their identity, and short of the therapeutic process over months, they're not going to change their mind. We have to accept it. But I don't think the share of people is as high as 50%. I think there is a majority of people who can be reached by argument. And this is one of the fascinating things. The data show this over and over again, that if you take a random sample, representative sample of Americans or Brits or whatever it is, and you communicate things to them, or you correct their mistaken beliefs, they're responsive to that. And the problem is that gets drowned out by the polarized communication online in particular that involves the hardcore types that aren't movable. But we shouldn't mistake those for what people in general are doing. I think it's really important. I learn this all the time. You do a large sample, representative sample, and all of a sudden the world is pretty normal. People are not totally crazy. It's kind of like, okay, I can live with this. It's only if you go on Twitter that it all goes by the wayside because you're dealing with extremes.
Oh, I would dare to maybe just disagree even with the 10-20%. Maybe it's even less, because we see people who advocated fiscal responsibility, individual freedoms, then wholeheartedly changing their mind and advocating something that's not. I mean, if the right overarching value is in line with their overarching value, somehow all of these details are not important anymore. So I'm just wondering whether we as scientists, need to find this overarching value or somehow communicate better. Okay, all right. I'm talking too much.
I think there is work on that either done or being done at the moment. In fact, the European Commission right now is running a project that I'm actually part of, where they're looking at communicating policies to audiences that have different values. Those fundamental Schwartz type values, and whether you can frame the same policy to satisfy people with different values, or at least, sort of make sure they're included. And the stuff that I've seen is pretty promising. I think you can do better if you communicate consonant with people's values. Now, there's a huge ethical issue here, though, and that is you got to be careful that you're not trying to manipulate and spin and trying to gaslight people into something they otherwise wouldn't accept. So all of this has to be done with great care. It's a minefield. You got to be very careful what you do.
You're right. I see in the chat, Rob says that I should be fielding own questions, and that Celia had a question about collective metacognition. Celia, would you like to?
Thank you. Yes, I found both talks fascinating, and they've got me thinking about what I haven't heard the term before, but what you might describe as collective metacognition. So I expect you're familiar with evidence from Steve Fleming's lab and elsewhere that when it comes to individuals, extreme political and religious beliefs are associated with weak metacognition on very simple tasks. Like, you ask people, are these two lines parallel or is one of them tilted relative to the other? And then you ask them, and how confident are you of that answer? And the people whose confidence is well calibrated with their accuracy are less inclined to have extreme beliefs than those whose confidence is poorly calibrated. Now, of course, in a way, what Stephan's describing is extremely explicit collective metacognition. You've got a group of scientists, for example, who are very much aware that they may be wrong, and they're trying really deliberately hard to work out what the right answer is and how likely their current views are to be reliable. I wonder whether that is a more general feature, as it were, of group decision making, that if as a group the members are cognizant of the varying reliability of their views at a given time and are asking themselves, do we have reason to believe that we're right in our judgment, whether that, is likely to be a recurrent feature of good collective intelligence?
I think it's a fascinating question and a really great question, but I don't have the slightest idea. I don't know of any collective metacognitive work. Well, hang on. Having said that, when Helen Fisher has done some stuff along those lines with climate change, unfortunately, I don't remember the details, but I would ask her first. Let's put it that way. But beyond that, I'm sorry, I just don't have a good answer. Maybe Stephen knows something. He's still here, is he? I can't see him right now, but yeah, I don't know if he's done that.
No, it's a great question.
That's a good lead, Helen Fisher. That's great. That hasn't come up, Mirta, in your collective, as it were, on collective intelligence. It did come up in work from cultural evolution or anything like that?
No, to be honest, I'm not aware. I know, of course, many studies, recent studies from Ralph Culver's lab, from can't remember. They would ask individual members of the collective for their confidence, and would look at how that affects their likelihood of moving towards the collective opinion, or sticking with their own. And this this relationship between different individual confidences seems to be one mechanism of how groups decide who is expert and how to. But I'm also not aware of somebody asking it on a collective level, how confidence is the whole collective.
Of course, I think confidence reports in a group can also be a major source of bias, that the people who express high confidence may be overweighted in the decision-making process, even though they as individuals may not be very well calibrated.
It seems that I remember the other lab is Centola's lab or Becker's lab. It seems that though that there is some idea about that there is some relationship between confidence and actual accuracy, and that using that can be a valid cue for collectives to increase their performance. by identifying accurate members. Anyway, this doesn't answer your excellent question.
Thank you.
About collective confidence. That's good.
Okay.
Can I throw in something that was triggered by a comment from Rob, and of course, yeah, there's one whole big issue in sort of, I guess, metacognition in groups, which is false consensus effects and pluralistic ignorance that have very disturbing consequences. So a false consensus effect arises when a minority feels that they're in the majority. And pluralistic ignorance is the opposite, that the majority feels they're in the minority. That happens on occasion. I published a paper, I think last year, recently, on people's hopes for the future after COVID. And I presented them with a number of scenarios. You know, one of them was to sort of build back better, green, kind of deal with climate change, progressive scenario, and the others were basically return to normal. And it was fascinating because we had samples in the US and the UK, and in both cases, people overwhelmingly, you know, pretty overwhelmingly wanted a progressive, build back better, greener future. But they all thought that they were in the minority and that what the majority wanted was actually a return to normal. There's this complete divergence in people's calibration to their own, the prevalence of their own opinion. And the problem with that is that one consequence of this is that over time, people's opinions shift towards what they perceive to be the majority. And so you can have the situation where an actual majority opinion never finds expression politically, because the people who have that view, the large majority, never see it articulated and feel they're in the minority. And so they kind of withdraw from it. And that's happened in history in a number of situations. There's work by Todorov on that in relation to the invasion of Iraq, when Americans in their majority actually wanted the Bush administration to be multilateral. But that majority thought they were in the minority, that everybody else wanted to go unilaterally. But it wasn't true. It was simply that all the talking heads on radio and TV were saying that. But people actually had a very different opinion. But that never expressed itself politically. And so this metacognition, I think, Celia, is a very interesting question, because there are these specific cases where it's very problematic that people in the majority who think they're in the minority very often never get their position articulated.
No, I completely agree. I noticed that we have a question from Gabriela in chat. Would you like to ask us? I don't know if she's still there.
Sorry about that. I could not figure out how to unmute myself.
Sorry.
I'm like, building the world's craziest neural networks, and the mute button confounded me just then. Sorry about that. So I was just listening to this conversation, and then listening to Stephan just now makes me wonder how we would correlate the effects of propaganda on metacognition. Because what you are describing is precisely that, and how propaganda is used to influence the belief systems of the masses. And it's a really kind of subversive psychological warfare kind of technique with propaganda. And how do we relate those against each other? Like, what kind of regression would we even be using? And then just overall, like, how do we quantify this mathematically? And then how do we, because I feel like there's an answer there if we can harness that understanding and understand how we can communicate with everyone using these techniques, but not being so subversive about it. Because my original comment was about the fact that, you have to get past this science denial kind of attitude that a lot of people have. And in my experience, which is very limited, it goes above and beyond the people who deny climate change and who deny vaccines. these people, there's just an overarching and growing attitude about science being unbelievable and not credible. And so I feel like there's some congruency between these two topics on how are we going to use the power of getting the word out there to communicate to people, to let them know, you know, what's going on in the science, because the typical American isn't going to attend a workshop like this and find it fascinating and enjoyable. They're going to want to run the other way. So what do we, you know, I think there's multiple layers to what I'm talking about, but as I'm listening to these discussions, I'm just really intrigued by how we, one, measure that propaganda metacognition piece, and two, how we harness that to communicate science in a way that's going to be effective to the overarching majority of people, so that it's not like immediately shut down. So if I tell someone that I work in computers, there's no issue. If I tell someone I'm, you know, looking at cognitive science, it's like, oh, you're one of the, it's like they shut down immediately, even though they both use the same thing.
Yeah, do you want me to comment on that? Yes, I think, I mean, first of all, I agree with you, of course, you know, propaganda is all around us, and it's a blizzard of propaganda. I mean, yes, no question. And that is problematic, and we can measure the outcome. I mean, you just look at, you know, the opinions of Americans or the British public vis-a-vis, you know, kind of like well-established facts, and you find that there's often a stratospheric divergence. So propaganda is hugely important. And how can you deal with it? Well, that's the million-dollar question. And I'll pop a link in the chat of a report for the European Commission that I was involved in recently, that is surveying that whole pressure point between human cognition and the online architecture and how that is toxic for democracy. And I think, again, the answer isn't just psychological. There's nothing as cognitive scientists we can do to you know, deal with that on our own. The answer is political and regulatory. You have to, you know, regulate the social media platforms who are vectors of a lot of misinformation. And the million-dollar question is, how are you going to do that without censorship? Now, I personally believe that the European Union is actually, you know, moving in the right direction with their Digital Services Act and the Code of Practice, both of which were just accepted by the European Parliament, which has some clever stuff in it. So, for example, Facebook and so on, they now have to submit annual reports to the European Union about their effect on democracy. They have to audit themselves every year and convince the European Commission that they are not corroding democracy. I think that's a really interesting exercise. I mean, of course, they'll you know, I can guess what they're going to do, but still, they have to at least do it. They also have to make data available to researchers, and there's going to be an increasing push towards auditing of algorithms, which to my mind is absolutely key in this, because part of the reason misinformation and anti-scientific information is spreading so fast and so far is because the platforms are favoring it, because it generates more engagement. So their algorithms are going to say, oh, great, we can make more money from advertisers on any nonsense that is opposing science. And that, I think, is a key thing that has to be harnessed through regulation. You can't do that through cognition and little experiments in the lab. That's a major political issue. As always, it comes down to politics. I hate to say it, I'm like a broken record, but you know, if you work on anything interfacing with policy as a cognitive scientist, you learn very quickly that the answer is always political.
Thank you very much. This was excellent discussion. I think the one that I didn't contribute to, but thank you all. I will be your Rob, and I will put an end to this and
Okay.
and send us all to their other activities. And thank you, and see you next week or so. Bye.